In the earliest form of plain chant, musical monks would sing a meandering tune with no accompaniment, no discernible rhythm, and no harmonizing. They are singing together in unison. Plain chant stayed the same for centuries. But then, sometime before the 8th century, someone somewhere had the bright idea of adding some young lads to the choir. It sounds fuller and brighter with higher and lower voices combined, doesn't it? The boys sang an octave higher than the men. It's called an octave because in church music at the time there were only 8 notes to choose from. On the white notes of a modern keyboard, the 2 lines of voices are 8 notes apart. Having men and boys sing an octave apart prompted a further thought. What if we had 2 notes together that weren't octaves, but completely different notes taken from the choice of 8? What if they added this note, for example? Genius. They didn't go too far, mind. The new line wasn't independent, but stayed exactly in parallel to the original. This parallel lines technique, which began in around the 9th century, was called organum, because to them it sounded like an organ, which it does. What we're hearing is the first experiment in what we'd call harmony, the simultaneous sounding of more than one note. Bland and unadventurous it may seem to us now, but then, in the early hundreds, it was audio dynamite. The heady excitement of singing 2 notes at once had another spin-off. This time they went crazy. They stopped one of the lines moving around. In this form of organum, one singer just stays put on one note all the time. I say singer, but this technique is so boring to perform, they also used to play it on instruments instead. An organ perhaps, or now almost forgotten instruments like the psaltery, the hurdy-gurdy or the symphony. I'm not making this up. They really did have an instrument that played just one continuous note. They even had a name for the long-held note. It's a drone. This drone plus tune type of plain chant is still remembered today. On bagpipes, the perforated tube you play the melody on is still called the chanter. By the 9th century, the most adventurous musicians had started to mix the 2 available styles together: parallel organum and drone organum.
One such adventurer was Cassia of Constantinople. She is the first female composer whose name has come down to us. What makes her music intriguing is its unusual mix of simple but unpredictable harmonies. Harmony was the first giant step our medieval ancestors took as the year 1000 drew near.
The other was to alter the course of music history dramatically. It was the invention of musical notation. When a monk or nun sang plain chant in the centuries before about 800 AD, what they had in front of them was the text, in Latin, of what they were singing. Just the text. They had to memorise the melody. All this. This is one of the most spectacular feats of memory in the history of the human race. But it's also a bit mad. It might take 10 years of daily repetition and practice to memorise the entire plainsong repertoire for the church year. So it was deemed highly desirable to find a way of reminding yourself what the tunes for any bit of text might be.
This is a 3rd century Christian hymn written in ancient Greek. Above the words, tantalisingly, is a fledgling attempt at writing the tune down. Alas, so far at least, no one can agree on what exactly it's meant to sound like.
Hundreds of years went by until squiggles came along. That's not their real name, which is neumes, but squiggles are what they are.
This is a page from the Winchester Troper, the oldest surviving manuscript of organum anywhere in the world. It's the painstaking work of Anglo-Saxon monks.
What it shows is the Latin text that was intended to be sung with squiggles above the words and in the margin. The idea of the squiggles was to give some indication of whether the note of the melody went up or down over any given syllable, so they're better than nothing. But the squiggles had a major flaw. They were essentially a way of jogging your memory of a tune you already know. They're rubbish at teaching you a new tune from scratch.
That's because they're not very good at indicating just how high or low successive notes are supposed to be, like a map without longitude or latitude.
The breakthrough came in around 1000 in the Italian city of Arezzo, and it was the brainchild of a musical monk called Guido, known nowadays as Guido of Arezzo. Guido's methods were simple and clear. First of all, he gave the squiggles, or neumes, a standardised, easy-to-read form, so each note had its own symbol, or blob. He then drew 4 straight lines onto which the notes, or blobs, would be placed. One of the lines he made red to give you a fixed bearing as against all other tunes, a bit like the musical equivalent of the equator or the Greenwich meridian. So wherever the note or blob is placed represents its pitch position, that is, whether it's an A, B or C. La. If the note goes up, the blob goes up. La. If it goes down, blob goes down. La. Step by step. Ole, 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 ole.
Before Guido, you'd think up a tune and then teach it to everyone you know and hope they pass it on without mucking it up. After Guido, music could be fixed on a page and could be reproduced by someone who'd never heard the tune before. Guido's method has been refined over the years by indicating the duration of notes, for example, but it's essentially the same system we still use to notate music today.
But every time she asks me, do I look okay? I say, when I see your face, there's not a thing that I would change, 'cause you're amazing.
The ability to lay out multiple lines of melody on a kind of musical spreadsheet allowed composers to plot out far more complicated musical structures. This was to set music on a course towards greater and greater sophistication, all thanks to the bright idea of a monk from Arezzo.
The ability to formulate musical ideas on a page enabled a musical approach that was far more ambitious than anything that had preceded it. A story that has to be remembered and spoken out loud is necessarily less complex than a novel, which can be written down and unfolded over a much greater length of time. So it was with the invention of musical notation.
Now you could have multiple lines of music. Dazzling new possibilities for harmony began to suggest themselves.
What was needed to realise this potential was for a musician to go a bit mad, and his creative madness opened up the harmony idea to 1,000 new possibilities, which, helpfully, is what a bloke from Paris did in the 12th century.
His name was Perotin, and he composed music for the newly built Cathedral of Notre Dame. What he did was ask a seemingly simple question. What would happen if you had more than two voices singing at the same time? What if you had three? Or even, God forbid, four? This might not sound momentous now, but believe me, it was nothing short of a revolution in music.
Perotin strikes us even today as an irrepressibly adventurous creative force, a firecracker of a composer who conceived and wrote down the most complex simultaneous note clusters ever yet heard. A cluster of simultaneous notes is called a chord.
Here are some of Perotin's chords. Perotin also blazed the way forward in another area of music. He may not have been the first composer to bring rhythm into church music, but he's the first one to find a way of notating rhythm, using a system whereby shorter notes are bracketed together with a horizontal bar, what he called a ligature.
He was particularly fond of one rhythmic pattern, a pattern that you can easily remember because it's the rhythm of the theme tune to the Archers. Dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum, dum-de-dum-de-dum-dum. Perotin made that pattern his own, as you can hear in his hymn composed for Christmas Day 1198, Viderunt omnes.
In this remarkable piece of music, you can hear not only the jaunty rhythm, but the weirdly effective harmonies, amazingly advanced for their time. It's important to remember that before Perotin's time, most people would rarely have heard any music at all, unless they heard it in church. But around the 12th century, secular music began to step out into the limelight. The pathfinders were the Bob Dylans of the day, the trouvères or troubadours, travelling singer-songwriters who usually accompanied themselves on the early instruments available.
At the peak of the troubadour craze, several hundred of them plied their trade across Europe. Where did this troubadour phenomenon, with its songs of noble, elegant love, originate from? The answer may surprise you. It came from Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain.
Deus poderos,
In the music of the troubadours, you can still hear traces of the Arabic originals. Muslim Spain also provided Christian Europe with more sophisticated musical instruments that were to become central to secular music. The rabab, a precursor to the violin. The al-ud, which became the lute and later the guitar. And the qanun, an early type of zither.
And instruments weren't the only important thing that European composers inherited from the culture of Islam. The other was a flair for rhythm.
The troubadour songs, like their Arabic originals, were shaped by the poetic metre of their lyrics, so most of these songs have at least a gentle foot-tapping pulse, which is where Peritin got his rhythms from.
By the end of the 14th century, nearly all music's vital components have been discovered. Notation, both melodic and rhythmic, the layering of voices on top of each other,